So I brought up a tier list here. There it is. What I have here is a little bit of a tier list. I haven't actually done these in a while. And these are all the major dungeons that were in Classic. And luckily I was able to play through all the Classic dungeons. And I kind of want to get a sort of my own personal opinion about all of them. And some of them are good. I like a lot of these dungeons. But there are some that I could say I would not want to do again. I actually see this for Black Fathom Deeps. One of some pretty interesting quests. I think I'm gonna put it into the B tier. Now B tier I think is good. If you're gonna rank them down, S is excellent, A is great, B is good, C is decent / okay, D is bottom. I call it the not that good tier, shit tier. It's a shit tier. Now the reason I put Black Fathom Deeps down at B place here, it's kind of the same reason why I think it's kind of a mucky, wet place. It's not very interesting so forth. The bosses themselves, some of them are kind of memorable, like the end boss, of course, very memorable, as certainly has a little bit of flavor to it. But most of the time, you're kind of facing off against just like hordes of Murlocs and of Naga. And the most annoying part was, for me, the Twilight guys, the cultists. They cause a lot of headaches, and a lot of the time, not a lot of groups knew much about that. They did have that interesting mini boss that dropped that really good shield for people that warrior tanks and that, and paladins. But aside from that, it's good. It's a fine example of how to do a classic dungeon, but at the same time, I'm just like, I know I can only like run like 1 or 2 times just for the quest and that. Okay, so Blackrock Depths. This is like very classic dungeon. Very long, mind you. It takes about 2 or 3 hours to complete it, but I loved every second of it because, you know, it's an A tier. I love Blackrock Depths. It's not S tier. Again, the length can be a little bit of a hinder or a little bit of a slash in people's enjoyment of the overall experience. But the amount of bosses you get, the amount of content is stored in this one, and the amount of just memorable experiences you get from this one. My favorite has to be when you're trying to get all the torches in that from the dwarves down near the second last boss. And you have to go and just speedrun it. I just love that. I love that to death. Just because of that. That's why it's A+, this A tier. Again, not S tier, but it's almost scraping the very top. Dire Maul, A tier. Dire Maul is divided up into 3 sections. And I think like out of all those sections, the ogre section and the first section with the night elves and that, not only is it rich in history, a fallen night elf city that has turned to deadly forms of magic just to try and sustain itself, and has like completely destroyed the ecosystem inside it, and just like has housed like demons and monsters. It's got a great zone, very open too. Very open for people exploring in that. I guess the only thing that kind of kicks down is that I didn't really feel too much about the second section of the whole dungeon experience. Ones with the fell imps and kind of going around. Although I did have a memorable experience going into it. Overall, a memorable experience, but at the same time, I just kind of was like, I can go without the second section. No Morgan. No Morgan is going to shit tier. I recently just went through this one actually on one of my alt characters for my alliance guys. Fuck this dungeon. This dungeon is long, it's boring, it's really dull, and the way you gotta like go around and that just completely is boring as shit. When I was playing with a bunch of guys actually, on my alt character, after we got the whole quest done, we all collectively agreed, fuck this dungeon, we're never doing this again. It doesn't require you to do any more reruns. You just grab your quests, you get them done in there quick as possible, and because it's just so drab anyway and so unmemorable of a location, you don't really give a shit about it. It's annoying, it's frustrating, it's everything I listed. It could probably be the worst dungeon in the entire game, and one I highly recommend to avoid. You got better locations to go. You can like wait a few levels, go to Uldaman. You can, and if you really want to, you should go Shadowfangkeep. That's another good one too. Just fuck Gnomeregan. Lower Blackrock Spire. Now you saw me do this one on the stream right before the end of it. It's kind of the same as like Black Fathom Deeps. It's a B tier. Some of the bosses are kind of cool and interesting. The hex boss and the spider boss and that. But everything else is like the bosses themselves. Like at this point, they're just kind of tanking spanks. And also the fact is, like, I think at this point, it's kind of like one of my least favorite of the Blackrock dungeons. Like, sure, the upper Blackrock Spire, it's kind of interesting. It's not on the list here, but that's just because it's like it's a 10-man dungeon. So if I was gonna put that anywhere, it would be probably an A tier. And that's mainly because of nostalgia purposes and because, you know, it housed one of the biggest memes of the generation. But Lower Blackrock Spire is just kind of that one you gotta get a bunch of people for, and in order for you to get a tune for the Upper Blackrock one, you have to go do multiple runs of it. And at that point, you're just like saying to yourself, what the fuck am I even doing? Can't I just do something else? But it keeps itself actually a B place because it does require a little bit more skill, even though some of them are tanking spank the bosses in that. And there are some exploits too, so I don't know. Maybe I should put it in C. I'll just put it in B for right now. Maybe once I get to the end of this whole list, I'll just figure that it's worth something, if not higher. Muradin. Now, controversial opinion. I like the history of the dungeon. A forbidden love between two very different gods made a bunch of ugly centaur babies. And the layout of it, kind of confusing. Not gonna lie. I think the scenery and the foliage and just the architecture of it is actually why I placed it a little bit higher on my list. So I'm gonna actually put it, usually people like to put Muradin over a D or even at best C. I'm gonna go put it down in B, but it's not like, I would say it's even better than Blackrock Spire in my opinion. Because even with Muradin, maybe just because I had much better experiences with people, and I was able to like go with so many people that I had fun with, and we did all this fun stuff in that. Sure, it's a long one. That's why it's not upper on like A tier, S tier, but at the same time, just from my experience, I actually do like it. But it also has detractors. It is a long one, and it can be very confusing. Ragefire Chasm. Very simple, very much just basic dungeon format. You got ads, you got bosses, you got two quests to do, and then you're done. So I'm gonna put it in the D tier because of that. And that's because I'm comparing it to the Alliance side, because at least with the Alliances, sure, they wait a couple levels, unlike Ragefire Chasm, you can do it at level 15. But with Deadmines, it's the fucking Deadmines. The Deadmines, the most classic of classic dungeons in all of World of Warcraft. And just comparing the two, Ragefire Chasm is just boring and unremarkable. Razorfindowns. This one I'm kind of conflicted about. On the one hand, yeah, it is kind of, the final boss is interesting, but the amount of trash I gotta go through each time I do this run, it just annoys me. So I'm gonna put it in okay. It's an okay dungeon. It's necessary for people who want to get the gear. I think it's like maybe necessary for like warlocks and maybe for some mages. Like they DM the fucking most to get into Razorfindowns. But for everyone else, it's just kind of, yeah, it's all right. I mean, that's kind of the same I also have for like Razorfind Crawl. It's not as bad as, it's not as like, you know, maybe as forgettable as Razorfindowns. But at the same time, maybe I just don't like the Quillboar as like races. Although their god is pretty kick-ass. Like the god is really badass, like a boar god. You take in the essence of it, and there's like Crone that rules at the very end of the whole thing. But it also has that one fucking escort quest where you have to go all the way around back to the level, and you can't go back. You gotta go another way. You gotta go on the lower levels, and it's annoying and it's long. It's not bad. Razorfind Crawl and Razorfindowns are not bad in the slightest, but they are hindered by the fact that the quests and some of the mobs in that fucking dungeon can be annoying. Skolamance. I love Skolamance. It's S tier. It's S tier. I ran it a couple times. It's very well compact, great history and lore. It's like it's actually one of the darkest ones in the dungeon catalog. Read it for yourselves. It's pretty fucking dark. But I love the bosses. The quests for that are long, but they're worth it in the end. And all around, I just love Skolamance, the atmosphere in it. A creepy warped version of like a Hogwarts, where like necromancers perform their forbidden arts. And you have to like take down each of the teachers and the people living there that have ruined so many lives on the island beforehand. Skolamance, S tier ranking. Shadowfangkeep, also S tier. Maybe not as like maybe not as highly intricate or as flexible as Skolamance, because they are still kind of linear. It's like Shadowfangkeep is still kind of a linear one with only like a couple of sections where you can like go and take off some bosses for yourself. But I just love Shadowfangkeep. It's a really good leveling area for like 20-something, 25s and that. And the way it kind of opens up in that, where like each encounter is like an experience. Each run with new groups is like an experience all around. And just because of that, and because like I had so much fun time, even the final boss, even though he was like the blinking back and forth, was like one of the first real bosses I can think of that I faced in that game. Scarlet Monastery. Now, I put it A. I know people like to put it S, but I also found the graveyard to be unremarkable. It's like only a couple bosses, and they're not even that good bosses either way. And I think because Scarlet Monastery is kind of overhyped in some regards. Except for the fact like the last two ones, the military ward, the military ward, as well as the ward where you face Whitemane, Sally Whitemane, fucking great dungeon experiences. Library is kind of good. It's all right. It's all right. Library is good. It's not high up there. The only thing that drags it down is Graveyard, but I put it a little bit ahead of like Blackrock Depths and Dire Maul, because it is still a memorable experience for some people. It's one that is like farmed the most by like mages and that. Like, good God, go to DMs and find how many people, into general chat, and find how many people sell Skolamance, because it's such a farmable place for gold as well as for boosts. So Scarlet Monastery, it's a great dungeon. I would just say Graveyard kind of puts it down a little bit. The Stockades, I kind of put it in the D tier. It's slightly better than Ragefire Chasm because it actually has more bosses in it, but also it's just a dank dungeon. There's like hardly any interesting bosses, and the fact is you're just kind of just like bitch slapping prisoners. Plus, by the time you actually complete it, the fact is that the mobs start to reset. So people have to be very careful, especially if they're trying to backtrack back out in the Stormwind, that those mobs will reset. Also, the fact is like there's a quest in there too where you have to like get red bandanas, and you have to clear a bunch of times just to get every single bandana because the drop rate is so shit. Technically worse than Nomergon? No, it's not. But is it the best dungeon ever? No, it's one of the worst classic dungeons. Stratholme. Both Living and Deathside are really interesting, and like it holds a lot of history in the Warcraft lore that it's honestly you can't really skip it at all. But at the same time, Stratholme, I'm gonna put it, it's kind of between A or B. I think I'm gonna go just A. A seems like a fair one. I like the layout of it. I like the part where you're trapped in this little cage and all of a sudden the fucking just rats just kind of just scurry in. I like the cathedral with the Scarlet Monastery stuff, Baron boss. It's pretty open-ended, but at the same time, Stratholme just kind of felt like a giant big mob full of just undead creatures and ghosts and crazy Scarlet Monastery cultists and that. Kind of really lowers it down in my books. The Sunken Temple. People I know, they hate this dungeon. And I get what they're going with though. It is a circular kind of place where you have to kill a lot of mobs just to activate these mirrors, just to kill the first boss. And then you gotta kill all these drakes so that way they don't fuck you over when the next and the last green dragon boss comes in. But I had a blast. The build up to the Sunken Temple was great. The bosses in it were highly memorable. I was highly satisfied with it. But the annoyances do come into play, so I am gonna put it, unfortunately, into B tier. It is frustrating for people who they just want to rush in. It's kind of a grind fest. But for me personally, I think it's very underrated and underappreciated. So people, please give Sunken Temple a try. It is worth your time. Just, there are some annoyances you'll have to combat in order to really enjoy this zone. The Dead Mines. Dead Mines is S tier. It's the fucking Dead Mines. It's one of the best dungeons in the whole entirety of the WoW dungeon history. It's great. There's like lots of history behind it. The Defias Brotherhood are like really good as like low antagonists for the alliances, especially human folks to like go up against. I've run it a million times. And even when I was Horde, I tried my best to try and find a bunch of group people to go out and with me to Westfall just to play the Dead Mines, because it's just so great. I love as you go through, you kind of get into like there's like an ogre that's like blocking the way. Then you have to go through the goblins that are working in this like giant boiler room / steam vault, and then it opens up finally with a cannon to this ginormous ship facing a dual-wielding Tauren, the Captain Greenskin, and then finally Edwin Van Cleef. There's just nothing like Dead Mines. Now, true, it is still an early one. That's why I don't really put it up there against, say, Skolamance, which is right now my favorite one. But the Dead Mines really does offer so much in just one package for early levelers. I would even say like higher level players that are past the threshold to be even going through it again will still go through it because it just offers so much. S tier. No questions. Let's just move on. Uldaman. What can I say about this one? Pros. It's an excavation, so it's kind of cool to see the history of the dwarves and the trogs and all that. Pretty cool end bosses in that. Kind of exploitable if you have the right gear, and it's pretty decent. Cons. Very mob saturated. It has a lot of mobs in it, a lot of winding corridors, and some of the bosses, aside from like, you know, the Colossal are just kind of reskins of previous ones, and it's not that memorable. I think in terms of enjoyability, I am going to put it into B tier. Not that it's a bad one. It is still a very worthwhile place to go to at mid levels. I think there's like way better ones to go through. The Wailing Caverns. Me and my friends, we do not like this dungeon. We do not like the fact that it's very confusing. We don't like backtracking. We don't like the bosses. And of course, that goddamn cliff drop that a lot of people don't know how to jump. It's going right between stockades and Nomergon. At least with the stockades, it's short and sweet. Or it's short and tolerable. But the Wailing Caverns is not. And just getting people to just like do it, especially in the Barrens, when you can just do the Baron's quest instead, is aggravating. So Wailing Caverns is like D, which is kind of like disheartening, because that means like a lot of the Horde players, they kind of got the shaft right up until Shadowfangkeep. Finally, we reached the last one in our list. It's Zul'Farrak. Actually, it's kind of a. I love Zul'Farrak. So in terms of the big four, I'm gonna put Zul'Farrak ahead of Shadowfangkeep. First off, I do like trolls. I have a particular taste for like troll raids. I think they're like, because they're always just expansive and rich with history, and the bosses are so much fun to have, or so much fun to play with. The part where you had to like defend up on top of the Aztec kind of temple while hordes of like other like of trolls come in, and all of a sudden then the people you save all of a sudden turn their backs on you, is so good. It offers one of the best trinkets you can get in the game. That 3% speed mount you get from Gazrilla. It's obviously, you know, it's worth your while to get that one just because of the 3% mount speed boost. The initial run and bosses aren't that highly memorable, like the one with the Basilisk and the one that had like all the zombies in it. I can only think of like 3 bosses that I actually legitimately like to face off against. And that's including the final 2 bosses that are together in tandem. I am going to drop it down to A tier. Ahead of Scarlet Monastery, it's still one of the best dungeons in the whole of classic WoW. And I was very glad to be able to run it with a lot of people. So in the end, this is kind of like my list in that. So S tier, Skolamance, Dead Mines, Shadowfangkeep. A tier, Zul'Farrak, Scarlet Monastery, Blackrock Depths, Dire Maul, Stratholme. B, Sunken Temple, Uldaman, Black Thousand Deeps, Muradin, Lure, Blackrock Spire. C tier,
the Razorfin Crawl and Razorfindowns. And D tier, the shit tier I call it, Ragefire Chasm, the Stockades, Wailing Caverns, and No More Gun.